I've been doing this for about 30 years, 30 plus years, and when I started there wasn't much work on emotion and neuroscience. There were a couple of people, you go to the Society for Neuroscience and read like a couple of posters, but in general it wasn't a very hot topic. And my first grant was submitted called something like Brain Mechanisms of Emotion, and it was rejected because you can't study emotion in neuroscience. So they said, well, you know, you're doing Pavlovian conditioning, so this is learning. So I changed the grant title from the neural basis of emotion to the neural basis of emotional conditioning. Got the proposal, funded, and been doing that ever since. So, but the whole time, what I was trying to do was to find a way to approach emotions in animals without being anthropomorphic, because I felt that that's what was getting in the way of studying emotions scientifically. I mean, if you look at all the old literature, going back to the late 19th century all the way till now, basically, people will do research on an animal but talk about what the animal is feeling. And I just felt that that was not very productive. So I found a task I could use to study fear responses in animals and operationalize fear in this way, as the processes in the brain that detect and respond to danger. So that's pretty straightforward. You don't have to assume anything about the internal state of mind in the animal. You simply look at how the brain is detecting the stimulus and producing responses. So in this, when I started this in the 70s, obviously cognitive science was up and running and everything was going great guns, and cognitive science had figured out a way to study the mind without solving the mind-body problem. But in emotion, the mind-body problem was front and center. So people were interested in where is the fear, not how does the brain detect and respond to danger. But I was interested in how the brain detects and responds to danger. So did all this work. 1996, wrote the Emotional Brain, and then for the next 16 years up until now continued to do this. Then all this time though, really something was sort of nagging me. And while the operational definition was useful as a research strategy, it had these things that bothered me. One is that it seemed to diminish the state of fear itself to talk about it in this way. And on the other hand, it also was asking too much of the mechanisms that I was studying. So in February, I published a paper saying that, you know, I haven't been studying fear or emotion at all. And that's what this paper called Rethinking the Emotional Brain is all about. It's a long paper. I think they gave me 26 pages to do this in Neuron, which is a lot of pages in this journal. And I got to say almost everything I wanted, but you know, since then I've kept revising it, and now I'm writing a book on it, and so it's pretty much what I wanted to say, but there are subtle things that are beginning to change a little bit. But anyway, let's go through the basic argument in the paper. So, you know, if you look at the growth of emotion in neuroscience and psychology, it's pretty dramatic over the last 30 or so years. And in spite of this, papers on emotion almost never say what they're studying. They study emotion. And the problem there is that, as Fair and Russell once said, everybody knows what it is until they're asked to define it. And the other thing that's said is there are many theories of emotion as there are theorists, and sometimes it's said that there are more theories of emotion than theorists, because some people have 2 or 3 theories. So, you know, I think if we went around the room and, you know, I individually asked each of you in private what emotion is, I'd get a different answer from almost everyone. So, you know, in general, even, you know, if you get into you look at a journal like Emotion Review, which came out a few years ago, to kind of grapple with some of these issues. You know, every month there's another debate about what emotion is and how it differs from other aspects of mind and behavior. So it's a volatile area and not much consensus. So how can we study emotion if we don't know how to define it? And I think the short answer is we simply fake it, especially when we're dealing with animals, right? So we have introspection tells us that some mental states have a certain feeling associated with them and others don't, so we call those emotions. The terms emotions and feelings are typically used interchangeably. And we have words like fear, anger, love, jealousy, and so on, all these feeling words. And we use these as guideposts as we go around researching emotion in humans or animals. So here are some words that are commonly used. These are so-called basic emotion words. But these are words that come from human subjective experience. And it's assumed that these words refer to neural systems in the brain that are hardwired and that generate these feelings of emotion in both people and animals. Now, whatever you might think about the use of feeling words as a way of studying emotions in humans, it really is a problem when we start turning to the animal brain and asking, whether rats have happiness, sadness, love, anger, joy, fear. You could say, okay, the rat it seems like it's afraid. It's doing what we do when we're afraid, so it must be afraid. But in English, we have 37 words for different aspects of fear. What does the rat have? Which word does it have for that? It's a complicated thing. So here we have. The rat he's afraid, but the cat is just waiting for lunch. And, if you actually wire up a cat in a situation like this that's about to eat a rat or a mouse, its autonomic nervous system is flat. Really, it's simply lunch. It's not a big deal. But we typically call that aggression, right? It's predatory aggression. But the cat is not aggressive. It's just simply about to eat. I have a cat. I scratch it. I think it purrs. I think it feels good. But that's not really any way to do science. So, while there are phenomena that are shared by humans and other animals that are relevant to emotion, I don't think human subjective experience is the best way to go looking for these. So what do we do? I think the key thing is we have to separate the phenomena of interest from the concept of emotion. We have to separate what we're really trying to study from the words and concepts we have, or the theories we have about what it is we're doing. I think Linda said something like this in her talk too about what she was after. So we have responses to threats, tasty foods, drink, potential mates, other situations in which survival or well-being is challenged or enhanced that we typically use these emotion words for. And what I'd like to do is call these survival functions and circuits. So what are they? This is not going to look too much like emotion, so you're going to have to bear with me a little bit here. So we have defense, management of energy and nutrition, fluid balance, thermoregulation, and reproduction. So these phenomena are associated with emotion, sometimes closely, but I think they'd be interested if we never even had words or concepts like emotions and feelings. They're things that keep animals alive on a day-to-day basis. I think they're important for understanding certain emotions, but basically they aren't emotional phenomena. And that's a big part of what I want to tell you about today. So, but first let's talk about survival a minute. Hasn't this always been a focus in biological approaches to emotion? So Darwin talked about survival in his famous book. The limbic system was all about survival. People like Panksepp, Ekman, basic emotion theories are all about survival and so forth. We have evolutionary psychology, all about survival and emotion. But I think the problem is that they're talking about feelings in most cases. And again, I think that's really a problem. So I think what this does is it puts the evolutionary cart before the horse. And the questions are framed in the wrong direction. So we're looking backwards and anthropomorphically into evolutionary history by asking whether human emotions or feelings have counterparts in other animals. What we need to be talking about instead is to what extent are certain functions and circuits that are present in other mammals also present in the human brain, and what do they do? So we do have conserved circuits. They're just not feeling or emotion circuits. These are these conserved circuits. So but the goal here is not to replicate any traditional list of emotions. For example, you see there's no aggression or joy circuit listed. But I think aggression and joy circuit are related to these survival circuits in interesting ways. So aggression, you can have different kinds of aggression. You've got defensive aggression, and that obviously would go with the defense system. Predatory aggression is more about the energy nutrition system. Again, it's just lunch. Mate competition and, you know, inter-male fighting and so forth is more related to the reproductive system than to the others. What about joy, happiness, pleasure, reinforcement? So we often think of reinforcement and these sorts of reward processes as a sort of singular process in the brain, reinforcement. You know, I'm studying dopamine reward prediction error signal as the basis of reinforcement. But what makes a stimulus reinforcing? Somehow it's tied to these homeostatic metabolic systems. So food is reinforcing because of its relation to energy and nutrition. Drink because of its relationship to the fluid balance system, warmth to the thermal regulation system, and sex to the reproductive system. So there isn't a joy or happiness or reinforcement system. There are all these other systems that make those things reinforcing. I mean, it may be true that dopamine prediction error signals in the nucleus accumbens may be a final common path in order for these things to stamp in behavior in the Thorndikean sense of reinforcing the behavioral response so it's repeated in the future. But the thing that makes it reinforcing is much more fundamental. So, what about defense? I mean, surely fear is a product of the defense system. Well, yes and no. So we have defense circuits that are wired to respond to stimuli related to predators and tissue damage. But that's not all that we're afraid of, obviously. We can have the feeling of being afraid of starving, and that's more related to the energy system than to the defense system. The fear of dehydrating or freezing to death, again, fluid balance thermoregulatory system, or failing to perform sexually. And lots of fears that have nothing to do with any of these systems. Fear of failure, fear of being afraid, fear of falling in love, fear of being too kind, fear of getting undeserved attention. So these are, you know, we can't think of fear as being a product of a hardwired system. Fear is a mental state that is coming out of the brain somehow, but it's not because you've turned on the amygdala or any other system. I mean, that has something to do with it, which we'll get to it in some cases, but certainly not all. So, I sort of already said this, but let's just kind of go back to it. So, perceptual researchers long ago figured out that they could study how the brain processes sensory events without first solving the problem of how the events are experienced. I mean, that's what Alva's trying to get at here, is the nature of the experience itself. But all of cognitive science has basically been, you know, how to process the stimulus and so forth. And a lot of progress has been made on that. I don't think he would object to that, but there's been a lot of progress in understanding the sort of underpinnings of perception by taking this approach. We may not get at the experience directly, but we understand a lot more about what the brain is doing. But in emotion, the focus has always been on the feelings, again, whether we're dealing with rats or people. So, you know, but why do we have these sensory systems? You know, sensory and motor systems exist because they allow organisms to interact with the environment in the process of surviving and thriving. So, feeding, fighting, defending, fornicating, these are the kind of sensory motor integration systems. They are not there to make us feel afraid or to feel good when we have sex or anything like that. They're there to keep us alive. Their purpose, again, is not to promote these feelings. I mean, they may do that in humans and maybe other animals, but that's not why we have them. So all animals have to solve these kinds of problems. And, you know, even some things that aren't animals. I mean, you might even want to go back to plants, but I'll stop with single-cell organisms for the day. So here are bacteria living in a petri dish, and here's an experiment that was done by someone, I don't even know who, but here's they're spread out in the petri dish, they pour acid into the petri dish, and the bacteria all move away. Here are people in a swimming pool, pour acid, and they all move away. So, I mean, I know this is a ridiculous example, but the point is that removing yourself from harm is necessary to stay alive. Absorbing nutrients in your environment is necessary to stay alive. Reproduction is necessary for your species to stay alive. Thermoregulation, salt and fluid balance, all these things are required to stay alive, and yet these are things that can generate certain feelings in people. But they're not in the brain, they're not in the bacteria to generate feelings, they're in there to keep the organism alive. So there are a lot of differences, obviously, between a bacteria and a person. But as we look at the history of life on Earth, you know, we have at least the standard idea is that we start with single cells, and we have collections of cells, sometimes called colonies, that can even act as a unit. But then we begin to have multicellular, multi-system organisms, or what's called metazoa, or animals. So an animal is a complex collection of multiple systems, and here we can skip plants and fungi and all that for now and just stick with the line from unicellular organisms to animals, and just look at the nature of all the body systems that have to be controlled in an animal, and the question is, how does all that happen? Obviously the nervous system does all this under the direction of the brain. So when you go from a unicellular organism with no nervous system to multicellular collections of cells with no nervous system, but finally into organisms that have multiple systems that are then coordinated by a nervous system, you begin to have a different way of interacting with the environment and solving these fundamental survival problems. Now, invertebrates, which obviously precede vertebrates, have a variety of different kinds of nervous systems. But vertebrates have a singular kind of nervous system. The structure of the vertebrate nervous system from fish on through people is essentially the same, where you have forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain. Within each of those large divisions of the nervous system, there are highly conserved circuits that are repeated across all species. And then, of course, as you go from fish to amphibians and reptiles and birds and mammals, there are going to be differences. There are going to be lots of complexity added in different groups. And even within groups, there are going to be divergences that make things more complex as you go through evolutionary history. But there's a fundamental logic that is preserved, fundamental brain plan that is preserved throughout all these creatures. So, and these are some of the things that are highly conserved, the systems that we've been talking about, these systems that keep us alive, keep organisms alive. So, an important point, though, is that the systems are conserved, the brain circuits are conserved, but the responses that are generated can be different. So let's look at that. So these are rats having sex, and the only way for the rat to reproduce is for the female to curve her back like this. This is called lordosis. It's a special posture that she has to do. Now, she can only do this during her a certain phase, her ovulatory phase of her cycle, when she's making an egg. Otherwise, the back doesn't do that. So estrogen goes in, makes this possible, allows the male to penetrate and delivers semen so that the egg can be fertilized. Otherwise, it can't happen. So it's a highly coordinated system. We don't have anything like that. Monkeys don't need to do that either. They'd have it their ways. People do it all sorts of ways. So the behavioral response involved in something like sexual behavior can be highly variable across species, in spite of the fact that the circuit is essentially highly conserved. So this shows it in horse and rat and so forth. But basically the system is the same, the hormones are the same. There are going to be differences across species, no doubt. But the fundamental logic of the circuit is conserved. And this do the same thing here for energy and nutrition, highly conserved circuits, highly conserved hormones circulating through the brain and body and back and forth and all of that. So just a kind of very simple-minded idea of what one of these survival circuits may look like is you've got some kind of circuit, and I have it drawn as a circle here, but it's probably spanning multiple levels of the brain and many different areas and so forth. but its job is to generate some kind of species-specific innate survival response. That can be triggered by an innate stimulus that has been part of the evolutionary history of the species, but that can be modified through learning. So through learning, you can learn to what's dangerous, or who to have sex with, or what to eat, and so forth. So stimuli that are associated with these innate triggers become learned triggers and can activate the innate system. So here we see highly determined circuitry that has plasticity and can be controlled by novel stimuli. Now, one of the outputs of the survival circuit is to motivational systems that then can control instrumental goal-directed behaviors. So that allows, again, more complex and more plastic, more flexible kinds of responses. So let's put it into this is the stuff I've been studying for a long time. They used to call it the fear circuit. Now we'll call it the defense or threat-motivated circuit or something like that. But anyway, you've got sensory information coming into the amygdala. That information is processed through very elaborate circuits within the amygdala that are well understood now at this point. And I'm oversimplifying by showing the inputs coming into the lateral amygdala here, because literally they come into about 20,000 neurons in the dorsal half of the lateral amygdala that contain about 75% excitatory neurons, 25% inhibitory neurons. These neurons, these 20,000 neurons, are involved in the formation of an association between a novel stimulus like a tone and an electric foot shock to the feet that creates synaptic plasticity here, and that will propagate through the system to reach the central nucleus. So when the tone is presented at a later point, it gets through there and can activate these hardwired responses, freezing, changes in the autonomic nervous system, and endocrine responses in the body, again, through learning. So this is not an innate stimulus. It's a novel stimulus that's been learned about that can produce all this stuff. And from the basal amygdala, that same stimulus, this tone that's been paired with a shock, when it's going through the amygdala to do this, we call it a conditioned trigger of defense, but the same stimulus is also going over here. And at this point, it's now an incentive or a reinforcer. It's not, the stimulus is the same, it's the tone, but that stimulus now functions as something that can invigorate the nucleus accumbens, drive the ventral pallidum, activate motor systems, and lead to goal-directed behavior. In the case of the defense system, goal-directed behavior is the learning of what to do to eliminate either the CS or to prevent or to escape from the US, the shock. So these are goal-directed responses that are motivated by the tone, which is an incentive here, but a conditioned stimulus here. The conditioned incentive then is also a reinforcer, a conditioned negative reinforcer, because when a response is performed here that turns off that tone or eliminates the tone from the rat in some way, that response is then learned by the success in eliminating the aversive stimulus. So here we have learned instrumental behavior, hardwired responses controlled by learning. So there's both determinism and plasticity in this system. Now, I just want to take a sidetrack now and talk about something like the amygdala, which can be activated in both appetitive and aversive states. Now, that's sometimes used as an argument against so-called basic emotions theory, because you can have a amygdala or some other part of the brain activated during exposure to different kinds of Ekman phases and so forth. Now, while I disagree with basic emotions theory, I don't think this is the right evidence to make that argument. I've already made my arguments against it, but because here's just a hypothetical example. The stimulus is activating fear or joy. But as I've already told you, the amygdala has a lot of different nuclei, about a dozen or so, each of which has subnuclei and subnuclei. And human imaging can't resolve differences between these nuclei. but maybe it'll get better and we'll be able to pick apart the lateral nucleus and the central nucleus, but that's not enough. And here's why. So let's go back to the hypothalamus. We're going to focus here on the ventromedial nucleus of the hypothalamus and look at it right here. So these are old studies, electrical stimulation studies into the basal hypothalamus here. And you can trigger a lot of behaviors by different electrode placements in this area. So you can get sexual behavior, or attack, or escape, or a variety of other things, all within this general region. So that's kind of like saying, okay, you can activate, you get a pattern of activation in the human brain when you do different kinds of emotional states. But this is a study that Dayu Lin and David Anderson performed. And what they're doing is comparing fighting and mating, sort of like marriage. You know, the mice would mate and then fight and mate. So they do this in all counterbalanced ways. So you've got a male mouse in a cage, and they drop in another male, and so they fight. Or they drop in a female in heat, and they have sex. So, and you do it in all the proper orders and so forth. But what you find is that you get activation in the ventromedial hypothalamus during fighting and mating and so forth, and some other areas. So there's a lot of overlap. So you might want to conclude that this region, the ventromedial hypothalamus, is involved in the same way in both behaviors. But if you really look at this at the cellular level, and I won't go through the details of how they did this, but they found that different cells, different ensembles of cells, are involved in mating and fighting. So even though it's the same brain area, it's different cells, different microcircuits, and human imaging will never do this. This is just a little reason why we have to do animal research to really understand how all this is going on, what's going on here. And I'm not saying that human imaging is useless. I'm just saying we need to understand what its value is and what its limits are. All right, so I've already shown you this, so I'm going to skip that. Now, all right, so I want to shift gears now from these kinds of survival circuits and turn more to the implications of what these mean for emotions. So even though I haven't been studying emotions, I remain interested in emotions and interested in how they come about in the brain. So what I want to walk you through here in this slide, and a couple of others like it, is what happens when you turn on a survival circuit in the brain. So here's the stimulus, the trigger. Let's say it's either an innate or a learned trigger. It's going to activate this thing here. And one of the consequences is that other survival circuits are going to be inhibited. When you're in a life-threatening situation, you don't take time out to have sex or to eat.
The road.
Well, if you're faced with a mugger, you don't say, "Excuse me, I want to go meet my girlfriend over here." So you got to deal with the danger that you're faced with. But there's a limit, right? So you may be really hungry, and even though you're in a life, it's going to be life-threatening to go out and forage for food because there are cats out there if you're a mouse. What are you going to do? At some point, you have to break down and just go bite the bullet and try to find something to eat. So, there's a dynamic relationship between all these systems. One can be activated and inhibit the others, but as motivational drive, or whatever you want to call it, shifts, or one thing rises in priority, the other thing is going to go down a bit in priority, and you're going to have to get some of these other things going. So let's just go through what happens here. All right, so in addition to inhibiting other circuits, one of the things that's going to happen is you're going to get a kind of global organismic state involving the brain and the body that's going to be relatively specific to this situation. I'm sorry, can you see that? So the stimulus is going to come in, activate the survival circuit. And one of the first things that's going to happen is you're going to activate modulatory systems in the brain. So dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, all these things are going to be flooded throughout the brain. They go everywhere, so they're going to potentially affect all parts of the brain. This is a kind of like alert signal. It doesn't tell you what's going on. It's just going to flood the brain with stuff that makes processing more effective. Now these modulators tend to they tend to have the greatest effect on neurons that are active. In other words, they don't turn on neurons. They make neurons that are active more efficient in processing, or less efficient depending on what they are. So the survival circuit, trigger comes on, activates arousal. Survival circuit will also produce all these responses. Each of these is a potential source of feedback into the brain. There are internal connections within the brain that will activate sensory systems, perhaps priming them to be together with the modulatory system. So you've got, say, norepinephrine in the visual cortex and activation from the survival circuit. So you're going to start processing those, say, visual or auditory stimuli more exclusively. You're going to have selective attention focused on these. You're going to have attention decision-making circuits that are going to be doing things as well. You're going to have these motivational systems and activation of goal-directed behavior, all the things we've kind of been talking about. So it's going to be a kind of global state that monopolizes the brain at this point. And I think these global organizational, global organismic states are important for feelings, but I don't think they are the equivalent of a feeling. I'm not happy with this particular description of it, witnessing of a global organismic state by consciousness, but I kind of like what it is. I think it's almost like what Alva was talking about, a presence. It's not, you don't have to create a feeling. A feeling comes upon you by the stuff that's happening in your brain and the body. So it's not something you produce, it's something that you experience once it's there. So I think it may be like a presence. I'll have to think about that a bit. So, the way I've been thinking about these things is that they're ingredients that contribute to emotion. So let me back up one step here. So I don't think we need differences between things like basic emotions and other emotions as categories of emotions, because I think they're all the same at the emotional level. What's different are the ingredients, the non-emotional ingredients. That's why I don't think basic and non-basic, or whatever else you want to call it, is the right way to think about it, because those are just experiences, say at the level of the cortex. I don't know if it is or not, but we'll call it this, from lack of a better term, this cognitive workspace, cortical workspace, whatever. Not because I'm committed to this idea, but just as an example of how this could come about. This is something that is fairly prominent in cognitive psychology, and we have some understanding of what it involves: working memory, attention, executive functions. But so we can think of these as ingredients that enter into this workspace where you then experience the presence of this emotion. So you've got body feedback, CNS arousal. Explicit memories are going to be triggered from long-term memory, from hippocampal and other temporal cortical circuits. You've got survival circuit activity, environmental stimuli. That includes both the physical and social context. Lots of implicit memory, action, habit kind of things activated. And language is there to help you categorize, semantically label, and also syntax to help you predict who's going to do what to whom in an instant, as opposed to have to learn about these things through trial and error through instrumental conditioning. So each emotion will have different ingredients in this view. And to the extent that the ingredients are different, the feeling will be different. So if we go between species now, to the extent that some species don't have these ingredients, they're not going to be able to have these kinds of experiences. So I'm not going to make any commitment about which species have which emotions, or if they have any other emotions, because all I'm saying is that if the ingredients are part of the nervous system, the ability to have these ingredients are part of the nervous system of that species, then they can have it. If some of the ingredients are lacking or different, then whatever experience that species may have has got to be different as well if the ingredients are different. So, again, I have no idea what another animal experiences. With humans, we can probably be on relatively safe ground, because we have, in the absence of psycho or neuropathology, our nervous system is basically the same. We have, our brain is organized in similar ways across all humans. We have the same capacities, in other words. We obviously will have individual differences in how those capacities are expressed and realized, and what sorts of tools and strategies, cognitive styles, or whatever you want to call it, will be realized differently in different people. But the general capacities are all going to be the same. We have language, we have blah, blah, blah. So, here again is the vertebrate brain, and basically the circuits and systems are very similar across vertebrates. In the hindbrain and midbrain, these are most similar across species. Forebrain differs the most across vertebrates, and its prominence distinguishes mammals from non-mammals. And within mammals, the prominence of the neocortex distinguishes different groups of mammals. So, if the parts of the brain that mediate feelings are the same in two species, then the feelings could be the same. But if the cognitive workspace, working memory, wherever this presence is going to be experienced in the brain is different, then the feelings would have to be somehow different. So, again, I don't want to make too big a commitment to dorsolateral prefrontal cortex or the cognitive workspace or any of that. Again, I'm just using this as an example of how something like this, how we could think about this in a concrete way. So, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is present in primates but not other mammals, and is especially well developed in the human brain. And so if this is important in the experience of these kinds of presences that are summed up and integrated from lots of different kinds of internal systems in the brain and body, then, and you know, it could be the insula, it could be anything, but that's not the point. The point is that it's the integration of information and the way this sort of filters up into the mind. So, let me just run through some summary points here. Brain circuits involved in key survival functions are highly conserved in mammals. Included are these things we've talked about. They're organized similarly in spite of the fact that they can control different responses in different species. When the circuits are active, you get this global synchronization, mobilization of brain resources that enhance survival. The circuits did not evolve to create feelings, but to perform survival functions. The global activity triggered is somehow related to, I think, what emotion refers to, but I guess I wouldn't say it's the same anymore. Motivation and emotion are continuous. So emotion is what happens when a survival circuit is active. Well, when some survival circuits are, this is another slide. So emotion can be what happens when some survival circuits are active, but then motivation is the brain's effort to deal with all of this activity. This obviously would only apply to some emotion. Feelings result when consciousness feels the presence, witnesses one of these global states. The nature of feelings in an organism is the function of the kind of conscious capacity its brain has, from 0 to much. And feelings are greatly influenced by language. I think language is important in our categorization of the, so again, the 37 kinds of fear that we can experience. If you don't have language, then your range of experience is going to, or your range of ability to categorize the experience is going to be different. That's not to say that language determines what we feel, but as we grow up and we learn to associate words with not just objects, as Linda was talking about, but also with states, and people tell us what fear is and how we should, how fear is different from anxiety, or how these are different from trepidation and consternation and panic and on, then we learn to associate those things and to make judgments about when we're in a state of panic versus a state of worry. The particular circuit that's active can be instantaneously overridden by other circuits. Again, defense trumps feeding, but if deprivation is severe, then feeding overrides defense. Circuits can also be partly active and even co-active to some extent. Okay, there's, in the paper, if people are interested in some research questions, this may be particularly interesting to students. You can read about all these directions that I suggest we could pursue. How much time do I have?
Well, in total, it's another 40 minutes, including questions.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about one research project that I think kind of makes an important point in the context of what I've been talking about, although it's not why this study was done. But what it is a study where we've created learning without the animal having any external experience that requires that would reinforce or instantiate the learning. So what we're doing in this study is taking advantage of a new kind of technique that's available in neuroscience called optogenetics. And basically what you do is you take a light-sensitive molecule called an opsin, and you attach it to a virus, and then the virus takes that molecule, we have to inject it into the brain, where your brain area of interest, so we inject it into the lateral amygdala. And so once it's in there, the virus takes it into the neurons, where it then remains trapped. But the purpose of that is to get that light-sensitive molecule into those neurons where it will stay forever. Now, after a couple of days, you then take a very, very small fiber optic cable and insert it down into the lateral amygdala, or just above the lateral amygdala, and turn on millisecond bursts of light. And each time you turn on one of these bursts of light, the neurons in the lateral amygdala that have been infected by the virus, and that have the opsin, fire an action potential, or spike. So here, the thing has been injected in this side, but not this side. And each row here represents, okay, so these are the laser pulses, the light pulses. So here's some spontaneous activity of the neuron. And here, the light comes on, action potential, action. You can see that every presentation of the light generates an action potential or a set of action potentials from these neurons. It happens on the side where the virus is injected, but not on the side where the control substance was injected. Now, the standard theory of how learning takes place in the brain is through something called Hebbian association. Hebbian learning takes place, according to the theory, when a neuron is active and it gets another input. Something happens between the two neurons that then makes the connection stronger. And so what we wanted to do was test whether we could create learning in the rat, in the living rat, by turning on these cells, making them fire action potentials while the rat was hearing a sound. Normally we'd let the rat hear the sound and give it a shock to its feet to do this. But now there's no shock. All we're doing is making the lateral amygdala fire action potentials. So when we do that, you can see over this block of 4 trials, the rats learned to express the defense response, freezing, in the presence of the tone. The controls that just had the marker or had the channel rhodopsin, but then had unpaired training, the tone was never associated or was completely unassociated with the activations of the neurons. No learning takes place. So we're able to artificially induce learning and the expression of a defense response without any external experience of the animal of danger or threat or anything. So all you need is the brain to fire action potentials, to activate these survival circuits, to produce a defense response that has no subjective counterpart. I mean, there's no reason for the rat to feel afraid. All it's doing is hearing a tone that's been paired with depolarization in the lateral amygdala. So again, we have no idea what the rat experiences, but there was no personal experience of the rat to anything. They show no observable behavioral response to any of this activation stuff. So there are lots of things we've done with all this. And
I'm sorry, could you just clarify what you mean they show no observable behavioral response to activation?
Simply, when you activate the neurons by themselves.
Just the laser pulse.
Right. It doesn't, they don't, like, you know, it's not like a... So there's no...
It's only by pairing it with the tone that you get the,
right.
the defense.
tone and the shock. I mean, there are a lot of summation studies that I'm not going to go through, but you know, what we can do is create weak conditioning with a tone and a very weak shock, and then use depolarization on top of that and create stronger learning. So we can use depolarization that when paired with the tone doesn't produce learning, and tone paired with a shock that doesn't produce learning on their own, but they sum. So one of the things this tells us is that the lateral amygdala is a sufficient site for the creation of this kind of learning and for the expression of the fear response, Finn's response, in the presence of the tone. But it's not, you know, what happens is that it's not as robust as normal learning. So one of the experiments I'm not showing you here is that if we also give the rat a shot of isopaterenol, which is an agonist of norepinephrine, which now give it to systemically, this goes through the brain and body, it will then have a more normal level of fear responding. So when you add arousal to this direct depolarization kind of experiment and begin to involve broader systems in the brain and in the body, then you get a more robust kind of expression. And we know a lot about the molecular mechanisms that go on within the lateral amygdala for all this to happen, and I'm not going to bore you with all the details there. But okay, so I'm going to stop there. It's what I've tried to tell you about is why I think I haven't been studying emotion, what the importance of these survival circuits are throughout all forms of life. I mean, really, if you think about plants, they can absorb nutrients and do all of they have to survive as well in their own way. I mean, they're going to do it in different ways. But all forms of life have to have these survival mechanisms. And as we go through levels of evolution, the way that gets manifested changes as nervous systems come into play. But I don't know what to call it, the motive or the desire of the organism to live is made possible by these kinds of things. But because they're so primitive, they can't be the reason that we have feelings when these circuits are active.